WSBT-22 Campaign 2024 continues our commitment to bring you comprehensive election coverage. Tonight, Bob Montgomery sits down with election experts to deliver you critical insights into the presidential and key contests in Michiana. WSBT-22 Campaign 2024 presents Election 2024 Town Hall.
It is now 5:29. Hey, thanks for joining us this evening for this election town hall. I'm Bob Montgomery from here at WSBT-22. Thank you for joining us, and we appreciate our panel here tonight. A quick introduction. Jeff Lehman is the chair of the Political Science Department and a professor at the University of Notre Dame. Diane Pinderhughes is also a political science professor at Notre Dame. Her resume is so long it would take the entire half hour to read it, so we won't do it right now. And Jamie Smith, of course, from IU South Bend. We've talked with him before, also an associate professor of political science from IU South Bend, and also runs the Public Affairs Department, or is the chair of the department at IU South Bend. Thank you all for joining us. I wanted to get right to this. We're not going to do an elaborate setup because we have so much happening in the news just today, this afternoon, that could have an effect on the election today. And we're talking about the Iranian attack, the missile attack on Israel. Diana, I want to ask you, this attack happens in the middle of the afternoon. Many people expected the attack, and Iran telegraphed the attack, essentially letting the United States know ahead of time. What kind of impact is this going to have on the issue of foreign policy and what foreign policy may do for this American election?
Well, it really challenges the Biden administration. We talked about the issue of the red line that Obama faced, and how do you deal with this kind of an attack? You want to not generate a regional war, but at the same time, you want to defend your allies' interests. So it's a very sensitive issue, and particularly in the middle of, we're less than now just a month ahead of the actual election. And
Jamie, does this take this issue of foreign policy and put it usually a little bit higher on the list? Sometimes they'll do a poll and they'll say, what are the items that are most important to you? And foreign policy, it's on there, but it's never necessarily in the top 2 or 3. Does this elevate its status, something like this happening 4 weeks out from the election?
Certainly. I think polling on this to date shows foreign policy probably in a top 5. But those issues like immigration, the economy, are right at the top throughout polling on the issue importance. However, this might become what political scientists call a kind of priming effect. I mean, you start viewing these candidates through a different lens, and it certainly could go up. The latest from Pew did show foreign policy is slightly more important to those who had said they were intended to vote for Trump as opposed to those who intended to vote for Harris.
And Jeff, does this mean Donald Trump has the advantage, if there is such a thing as an advantage, to an attack such as this? When it comes to just the foreign policy question and who will handle it better?
I think it probably does. I think it's complicated because there's really no distance between the two candidates when it comes to Israel. Both the Biden administration and the Trump administration have been very supportive of Israel. And of course, within the Democratic Party, the Biden administration has been widely criticized. And so I think from that standpoint, it may hurt the Harris campaign because it may remind certain Democratic constituencies, especially younger voters, what they were upset about with regard to the Biden Middle East policy in the first place.
I'll ask you about the vice presidential debate, which is also happening in about 3.5 hours from right now. As we look at the clock in New York City, we have an opportunity to hear from Tim Walz face to face with J.D. Vance for the first time and probably the only time. Do you think this is going to make a difference tonight, ultimately, and how this race is going to play out, and specifically, what kind of impact might it have?
Normally, I would say no. Vice presidential debate won't make much difference. But given that there's only been one debate between Harris and Trump, and there's likely only to be the one debate, it's possible this may make a difference. I think it will have more impact if one of the candidates is really terrible, which is what we've had in the first 2 debates. Obviously, the first debate didn't go so well for President Biden. The second debate didn't go so well for former President Trump. I expect it'll probably go fine. Both of these candidates will appear credible and intelligent and coherent in a way that maybe we haven't had in the first 2 debates. So it'll probably be a wash. But if there are some real flubs or if there are really embarrassing moments for one of the candidates, it could have an impact, given that it probably will be the last debate we see before the election.
And Diane, with the vice presidential race, it's not really a race per se. People vote on the top of the ticket, obviously.
Right.
You either like Kamala Harris or you like Donald Trump, and the others are the add-ons. Do you think ultimately, though, because it is so tight, that tonight's debate could have a pivotal moment in this race where it could, in fact, sway a couple of those undecided voters?
I do think so. I mean, it depends on, those personalities are so distinct. Vance could somehow hurt Trump. He's been seen as doing a lot of unusual commentary. Walz could step in Harris's way, but he seems to have understood how not to do that from the time he was named as her running mate.
And Jamie, specifically about the running mates in general, is this a situation where the running mates can actually factor into the race? People who say, you know what, maybe some of the Republicans say, not a huge Donald Trump fan, as we saw about 20% typically in the primary of the Republican primaries had voted for someone other than Donald Trump, pretty much across the board. Will J.D. Vance convince some of those never Trump Republicans to say, you know what, maybe I can go that direction? Or I'm not necessarily a Kamala Harris person, but Tim Walz I like, so I can maybe move in that direction. Will the secondary candidate actually sway votes one way or the other?
I think in the media environment in which these candidates are operating, they have a goal tonight to go viral for the right reasons, as in terms of what their campaign would see. So to execute what they need to do, and then also to echo what Diane was saying, essentially they need to, in this perhaps last debate for the cycle, really communicate what the person at the top of their ticket intends to do and really reflect that. So if they do that accurately and that appeals to voters, I could see it making a difference, sure.
Wanted to ask you about the polls. You mentioned some of the polling earlier. Jeff, the polls this year show it's tight by any measure. All the polls show, both nationally and you look at the swing states, it's going to be a very tight race for the presidency. Ultimately, the polls, though, have been kind of up and down over the course of the last couple of decades on accurately predicting who's going to win. We all remember the red wave that never necessarily materialized. Are the polls just that snapshot in time, or are they getting a little bit more consistent in the way that they're able to predict what's going to happen?
Well, I think polls, we have to remember there is a science of polling, but these are samples of voters, and even if they are completely representative of the electorate, they all have a margin of error. It's usually plus or minus 3 percentage points. And so when you're trying to predict races that are as close as these last few presidential races, and you're trying to predict battleground state outcomes that are as close as they are, polls are never going to do all that well. You know, and then I think polls are really good at telling us how people feel about an issue, but when you get into election polling, you also have to figure out who's a likely voter and how might undecided voters sway. And that becomes a bit more of an art than a science. So I think the polls have not really been any less accurate these last 2 election cycles than they usually are. It's just that the elections have been so close and the key states have been so close, and polls are not great at predicting those close outcomes.
Diana, I'll ask you kind of this $64,000 question on the presidency race. And is this race ultimately a referendum on Donald Trump?
I thought about your question. I think it could be seen that way. Certainly, he has been president previously, so I think a lot of his supporters would be willing to vote for him again. You could argue that it's really a referendum on Harris, who's been vice president but not served in a leadership position. I do think Trump's continuing unusual ways in which he interacts with the public makes him a referendum on him.
And Jamie, about Vice President Harris, because she became the nominee by de facto, in essence, because of the stepping down, I don't want to say resignation of President Biden, he's still the president, but since he stepped back as a candidate, and she never really went through the primary process directly as an individual candidate, how much does that help and or hurt her?
Well, a lot of the narrative around that has been that voters need to get to know Harris, that former President Trump is running in a 3rd straight election, one of few individuals to do that. So he's a known quantity to most voters. Harris had a kind of hill to climb. However, I think it really speaks to the polarized nature of our parties right now, that, I mean, she's again, part of this administration, number 2 in this administration, and comes to be a face of that administration. And so voters, I think, on the Democrats' side were ready to support her.
And last question on the presidential race before we move on to some congressional questions as well, and that's about the swing states. And Jeff, and I'll ask you this. Obviously, Michigan is a swing state, and it has gone both ways over the course of the last several election cycles. How do you think Michigan shakes out this year?
Oh,
no pressure.
I have no idea, Bob. No, I think the blue wall states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, have been the be-all, end-all of the presidential races. Trump won all 3 very narrowly in 2016, and President Biden won all 3 also narrowly in 2020. So Michigan's extraordinarily important. I think Vice President Harris has to win Michigan. Right now, she is up in Michigan. I suspect she will win. They have a very popular Democratic governor in Michigan. President Biden won the state. So I think it's hers to lose, but it's, of course, probably too close to call.
Is a lot of people are saying it's the Keystone State. Pennsylvania is the key state. Is it Pennsylvania this year?
Oh, I think it's probably Pennsylvania out of those 3 states simply because it's bigger and has more electoral college votes.
Right. Okay.
And so you could probably lose Michigan, but it would hurt a lot more to lose Pennsylvania.
On both sides? Both sides. Okay. All right. Very good. All right. And tonight's debate will feature topics, of course, including abortion rights, family issues, as well as others, as we're looking at different contrasting views. The nominees are also expected to play up their middle-class roots to appeal to voters. Our coverage with the debate tonight, this is the vice presidential debate we're talking about, starts at right here on WSBT 22, 8 p.m. The debate itself starts at 9. You can watch it live right here on WSBT 22 and CBS News.
WSBT's commitment to bringing you comprehensive election coverage continues. This is Campaign 2024 Election Town Hall on WSBT 22 News at 5:30.
And thank you again for being with us. We appreciate you stopping by this evening. I'm going to start with Jamie Smith on this question. We're talking about some congressional races. All 3 of our area districts right now are Republican. Some would say solid Republican. What did the Democrats need to do to win even one of those seats, Jamie?
Well, I would start by saying that none of those seats are really classified as competitive, and that will change a lot of the dynamics with how candidates approach it. I would also say that the area, in one sense, is like a lot of areas across the country, in that most House districts are not as competitive as they once were, and that can vary from state to state and how lines are drawn. But in a lot of cases, these House races are classified just as very safe for one party or the other.
And Diane, does that also mean that the opposition party, in this case the Democratic Party, will not necessarily put up the very best candidates? And that is no slam on the current candidates who are running right now, but obviously money talks, and you're able to attract a candidate who is perhaps more viable going against a seated incumbent. Is that kind of a self-fulfilling circle or it's a vicious cycle or a self-fulfilling prophecy where it's just going to continue to churn like that?
You've got to get a candidate, and that person's got to have some experience. They've also got to be able to raise some money. So the challenge of finding a good candidate with some experience and the ability to fundraise it's not a simple process.
Yeah, and of course the possibility of winning will come into that quite a bit, because then you start talking about DNC money that comes in, and that's
right.
That's a whole nother level. Jeff, what about the issue of debating here? We were talking about debates in the first segment. There will be a congressional debate. In fact, we'll be hosting it here on our WSBT 22 studios for the 2nd congressional district in northern Indiana. But the incumbent, Rudy Yoakum, is once again saying he's not interested. Well, we think he's saying he's not interested. He's never responded to our request, so we're assuming that he's not interested. Does that fact sway voters one way or the other, the fact that he doesn't show up for a debate?
Oh, I don't think so. I think former President Trump showed us in this past Republican primary season that if you're way ahead, it doesn't hurt you at all to not debate. In fact, it could hurt you to debate. So maybe it sways a few undecided voters, but he has won his last election by such a large margin in such a heavily Republican district. And frankly, he's running against a candidate with no political experience and very little money. So he is almost certainly going to win this race, and so he really has nothing to gain and everything to lose. So as rude as I think it is for him not to respond, I think he's probably doing the wise thing.
Do you and this is a bigger picture, Congress control. We talk about the tight race between the presidency. The control of the Congress is about as tight as it is, as we have seen in decades. And there's no necessarily indication that it's going to swing one way or the other. It's going to remain very tight. What do the Democrats need to do to pull off control of either the House or the Senate? And what do the Republicans need to do to maintain that control?
I think that depends on which chamber of Congress you're talking about. Of course, the Democrats have control of the Senate right now, but we only elect 1/3 of senators every 2 years, and this particular election cycle is very unfavorable for the Democrats because they are defending far more seats than the Republicans are, and they're defending seats in places like Montana or Ohio that tend to be more Republican. So I actually think the Democrats have a better chance of gaining control of the House, where they are now the minority by 8 seats, than they do of winning control or maintaining control of the Senate, where they currently have a majority.
Diane, how big are the coattails this year, the presidential coattails?
I thought about that question too, and things are so tight that I don't expect there to be much in the way of coattails. We'll have to see how each race comes out in literally each district, see what the final results are, and then see what the presidential race, of course, will matter. But at the same time, they're so tightly connected to each other that it's unlikely that there'll be any coattails.
Okay, very good. All right, WSBT 22 is going to air a statewide gubernatorial debate coming up on Thursday at 6 p.m. The debate will take place in Indianapolis with Republican Mike Braun and Democrat Jennifer McCormick. Libertarian Donald Rainwater all have accepted invitations to appear. That debate is being produced by Wish Television in Indianapolis, but it'll air exclusively right here in South Bend on WSBT 22.
WSBT's commitment to bringing you comprehensive election coverage continues. This is Campaign 2024 Election Town Hall on WSBT 22 News at 5:30.
All right, we talked about the presidential race. We've talked about the congressional races and control of Congress and what's going to happen there. Anybody's guess on all of the above so far. And the Indiana governor's race at this point, if you believe the polls, appears to be a little more predictable, for lack of a better term. Jamie, I'll start with you. Jamie Smith from IU South Bend, thanks again for being with us. Do you see any signs? It's been 20 years since a Democrat has been the governor of the state of Indiana, really held significant numbers of statewide offices, in general statewide elective offices, from the Secretary of State to the Attorney General, et cetera. Do you see any signs that that could change this year, especially in the governor's race?
Well, even with the polling being fairly limited in these down, I mean, it's not a down ballot race, but in a presidential year, I mean, right, our gubernatorial races sometimes get second billing, and we start learning about the candidates a little bit later. As you mentioned, most of the polling is showing it a pretty wide gap. Some of the internal polling on McCormick's side is showing it a little bit closer. However, if you combine that polling gap with the historical trends that you've mentioned, it seems like we're probably going to see that continue in the state of Indiana. We haven't really had a really close race for over a decade, right? 2012 was maybe a little bit closer than we remember in terms of the final tally, but haven't really had anything close since.
Jeff, I wanted to ask you about the use of artificial intelligence or deep fakes. Just within the last couple of days, the Braun campaign has been accused of using artificial intelligence and essentially creating an advertisement. In fact, I think we have a picture of it here. It's Jennifer McCormick, the Democrat. This is the original. This was a rally in South Bend on the courthouse steps. You can see people in the background holding Jennifer McCormick signs. Well, the Braun campaign turned those signs into this. Says no gas stoves. Same picture, same people not holding those signs, obviously. And the idea was that, according to the Braun campaign, Jennifer McCormick is, quote, too liberal and too woke for the state of Indiana. And there's some issue with that. Are you concerned about the use of this sort of technology for this sort of purpose?
Yes, very much so. I think we're just at the leading edge of the possibilities with artificial intelligence of doing these deep fakes. And I think we have to be very vigilant about them. And so I think it's a constant worry, and I think we're going to just see more and more of this in years to come.
Diane, do you feel as though that this is an issue that's going to rear its head again with 1 month to go before the election?
Well, if it's happening in Indiana, I guess it'll become a problem throughout the country, and it's something of great concern.
Yeah, and the problem with that, it's also difficult to discern.
Yeah.
what's real and what's not just by the naked eye.
And I would also just add, as we move more from a long-form journalism era to a meme era, I mean, most of the things that individuals are running across on these platforms might be constructed with that. So it's, as Jeff said, it's just very important for voters to look twice at claims and make sure they're accurate.
Okay. All right, Jamie, thanks very much for that. WSBT 22 is hosting Indiana's 2nd District congressional debate. A week from today, Democrat Lori Kemp and Libertarian William Henry have agreed to this debate. Now, the Republican, as we mentioned earlier, Rudy Yoakum, has not agreed to this debate. You can watch it live, though, from our Facebook page and our website, YouTube channel as well. And we'll be right back to wrap up.